You can't imagine what the girl in this story has been through. I believe you will be shocked by what she has been through. Please watch the whole video to understand more about the life of the 10-year-old granddaughter and her grandfather. Nice to meet you again in today's story. The car stopped in front of the gate. The driver, an acquaintance of Mr. Walters, got out and opened the door for the girl. Emma got out slowly, her legs still shaking a little. She carried only a backpack and a small purple suitcase, dusty from the long journey. Her dark brown hair was slightly messy, hanging down, covering most of her pale face. Mr. Walters stood waiting on the porch, tall and thin, wearing old denim overalls and a rolled-up plaid shirt. His beard was streaked with gray, his eyes deep and deep. He did not come to hug his granddaughter like people usually did. He just nodded slightly, as if to confirm, "Yes, it is him." "Hello, sir," Emma mumbled, her eyes still on her muddy boots. Walter nodded. "Come in, it's getting dark." The old wooden house smelled of pine and the dust of time. Emma's room was upstairs, at the end of the hall, where her mother had been. Walter hadn't changed in all those years. There were still a few old books on the shelf, a faded rag doll, and a small framed photo of Emma's mother as a child, her face vaguely similar to Emma's now. Emma looked around, put her suitcase down next to the bed, and sat down, hugging her knees. There were no tears, just a feeling of emptiness creeping through her. Dinner was fried chicken and boiled vegetables. Walter wasn't a good cook, but he wasn't a clumsy one either. Emma ate little, mostly picking vegetables. The two of them sat across from each other at the large wooden table, so quiet that the ticking of the clock could be heard. "Would you like some more?" he asked, his voice hoarse, not forced but not intimate either. Emma shook her head. "I'm full." Walter didn't press him, he was used to silence. But Emma's silence made him uneasy. He looked at his granddaughter, so small, so frail, and sighed. That night, Emma lay facing the wall, her eyes wide open in the darkness. Downstairs, Walter sat on a wooden chair by the window, reading with the light on but unable to read a word. The image of the little girl was all that was on his mind. And a question that no one dared to ask aloud. What had happened to her? After all? The next morning, the early morning sunlight streamed through the small window, casting streaks of light on the walls. The crowing of roosters and the distant sound of tractors signaled the start of a new day in the countryside. Emma woke up early but did not get out of bed immediately. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, her eyes wide open as if trying to find herself in a long dream. Walter had been up for a long time. He was feeding the chickens in the coop behind the house, his rubber boots sinking deep into the damp soil. Hearing light footsteps behind him, he turned around. Emma stood there, her hair disheveled, her slippers a few sizes too big for her feet. "Do you want to try feeding the chickens?" Walter asked, holding out a basket of grain. Emma hesitated for a moment, then nodded. The two of them worked quietly side by side. The chickens gathered around and chirped, and Emma chuckled when one pecked at her shoe. The laughter was as light as the wind, but it was enough to make Walter look up. For the first time since he had brought her home, he saw Emma's face soften, no longer as tense as a lake about to burst. "Have you ever had chickens?" he asked. Emma shook her head. "Never. There were no chickens in that place. Well, the place before." The words faltered, accompanied by a glance away, as if the name, "the place before," were taboo in her mind. Walter did not ask further. That afternoon, he took Emma to the village market. She stuck close to him, clutching her cloth bag, though the villagers were friendly. Emma never took her eyes off Walter. Whenever someone approached to say hello, her eyes would flash with panic. When Walter got home, he found a piece of paper on the kitchen table. It was a pencil drawing, a chicken pecking at grain, with the words scrawled beneath, "Her name is Becky." He smiled. It had been a long time since he had seen a hand-drawn piece of paper in the house. That night, Emma dreamed again. She dreamed of a dark room, where a large figure was approaching. There was alcohol on his breath, a low laugh behind him, and an iron-like arm around his shoulder. Emma woke up, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. She sat up, looking around the dark room in horror. The door opened slightly. Walter was standing there, holding a small oil lamp. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low. Emma just shook her head, her eyes red. He didn't come in, just stood in the doorway. "If you need me, I'll be sitting in the hallway. Just call." He turned away, but as the door closed, Emma said softly, I hate the sound of footsteps." Walter paused, turning his head. "Footsteps in the night. It reminds me." She didn't say anything more, but just that one sentence made Walter's heart sink. "Yes, then I'll go lighter. And if you need me, just call. No one comes into your room when you don't want them to. Remember that." The next morning, Emma found him in the chicken coop. She had a new piece of paper in her hand, and she had drawn a little chicken next to Becky. She held it out, and said softly, "I'll name him Walter, the leader of the flock." Walter looked at her, and laughed dryly, for the first time, perhaps, in many years. He nodded slightly, his eyes sparkling slightly. She was opening her heart, little by little. The summer in the village passed like a quiet river. The days at Walter's house gradually took on a rhythm of their own. Emma woke up at dawn every morning, helped him feed the chickens, picked vegetables, and sometimes watered the apple orchard behind the house. Walter didn't talk much, but he always saved the best part of the meal for his granddaughter, always paying attention to every sad look or every time she was startled by a strange noise. One day, while cleaning out the old barn, Emma found a small wooden box. Inside were her mother's belongings from the past, a diary, some colored pens, a yellowed photo of Walter and his daughter when her grandmother was still alive. Emma stared at the photo, her hand lightly tracing her mother's face when she was a child. Then she turned to him and asked, "Back then, did Mommy smile a lot?" Walter looked up from his tools, thought for a moment, and replied, "He smiles all day, talks a lot too, not like you at all." Emma chuckled, but the smile quickly faded, like a candle in the wind. "I used to talk a lot too, but not anymore." The words were simple, but like a small stone dropped into water, Walter felt something heavy spreading, circle by circle. One hot afternoon, Emma sat under a large apple tree, drawing book in hand. She was drawing a portrait of Mr. Walter, straw hat, rolled up shirt, hoe in hand, not exactly the same, but the eyes, those were the eyes, deep and warm like ashes. Walter came closer, glanced at the drawing. He said softly, "Drawing is also a way to remember, right?" Emma nodded, and not to have to say it. Walter asked no more questions, but he knew in his heart, there were things Emma couldn't name. So she used her drawing to hold on to, instead of facing them. That night, as she was getting ready for bed, Emma suddenly asked, "Grandpa, if a person does something bad to another person, but leaves no trace, will that person be punished?" Walter put down the book, looked at his granddaughter. He didn't rush to answer. He saw that the question wasn't a hypothesis, it was filled with fear and anxiety. If someone came forward to tell the truth, then maybe. Emma nodded slightly, saying nothing more, but Walter could see clearly. The girl wanted to say something, she just didn't have the courage to name it. One evening later, it was raining heavily. Thunder and lightning flashed. Emma curled up in bed, covering her ears, muttering an old nursery rhyme. Walter opened the door and walked in, holding a flashlight. He sat down on the edge of the bed, not touching her, just holding the lamp between them. "What are you most afraid of?" he asked. Emma trembled for a long time before answering. "I'm afraid of someone not believing me." Walter nodded, silently. He didn't ask, why, or what happened. He just said, "I believe you, whether you say it or not." One Sunday, Walter took Emma to the village church, where there was a small community service every month. Emma held his hand tightly the whole time, her eyes darting around restlessly. When the pastor reached out to greet her, Emma stopped, drew back, her face pale as if she had seen a ghost. Walter bowed slightly in apology and led Emma out. They did not speak all the way home, but he could feel that something in Emma had broken again, but he did not fully understand what it was. That night, while cleaning the room, Walter accidentally found a piece of drawing paper hidden under Emma's pillow. He did not mean to peek, but the drawing made him unable to take his eyes off it. It was a faceless man, with long, large arms, standing behind a small, crying girl. The corner of the picture was a dark room. The window locked. Walter's heart ached. The next morning, he visited June, his old neighbor and his wife's best friend. She had always told him about the village, and she knew his family better than anyone else. "When your daughter left to follow her new husband, I was worried," June said, stirring her tea. "What's wrong?" "The way he looked at people. Always smiling, but his eyes weren't smiling. I caught him screaming at your daughter in the parking lot, and she was quiet." Walter squeezed her hand. "Do you think he ever did anything to her?" June looked at him, was silent for a moment, and then sighed. "I don't know, but if you suspect something, you should trust your instincts." That night, Emma stood on the porch, clutching a small teddy bear. There was a light mist, and the moon hung low in the thin clouds. Walter stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "Do you miss me?" he asked softly. Emma did not answer immediately. After a moment, she said, "I miss when you were still me." "What do you mean?" "When you still saw me as a child who needed love, not a burden, when you still believed in me." Walter did not ask any more questions. He knew all the answers would come, but he could not force them. He just reached out, gently placing his hand on her shoulder, like an unspoken support. The next morning, he began writing again. One Sunday, Walter took Emma to the village church, where there was a small community service every month. Emma held his hand tightly the whole time, her eyes darting around restlessly. When the pastor reached out to greet her, Emma stopped, drew back, her face pale as if she had seen a ghost. Walter bowed slightly in apology and led Emma out. They did not speak all the way home, but he could feel that something in Emma had broken again, but he did not fully understand what it was. That night, while cleaning the room, Walter accidentally found a piece of drawing paper hidden under Emma's pillow. He did not mean to peek, but the drawing made him unable to take his eyes off it. It was a faceless man, with long, large arms, standing behind a small, crying girl. The corner of the picture was a dark room. The window locked. Walter's heart ached. The next morning, he visited June, his old neighbor and his wife's best friend. She had always told him about the village, and she knew his family better than anyone else. "When your daughter left to follow her new husband, I was worried," June said, stirring her tea. "What's wrong?" "The way he looked at people. Always smiling, but his eyes weren't smiling. I caught him screaming at your daughter in the parking lot, and she was quiet." Walter squeezed her hand. "Do you think he ever did anything to her?" June looked at him, was silent for a moment, and then sighed. "I don't know, but if you suspect something, you should trust your instincts." That night, Emma stood on the porch, clutching a small teddy bear. There was a light mist, and the moon hung low in the thin clouds. Walter stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "Do you miss me?" he asked softly. Emma did not answer immediately. After a moment, she said, "I miss when you were still me." "What do you mean?" "When you still saw me as a child who needed love, not a burden, when you still believed in me." Walter did not ask any more questions. He knew all the answers would come, but he could not force them. He just reached out, gently placing his hand on her shoulder, like an unspoken support. The next morning, he began writing in his diary again, for the first time in more than 10 years. His first line was, "He no longer trusts anyone, but he still trusts chickens. And trusts me. I must keep that trust." Autumn came with the smell of dry leaves and the mild air. Emma had just turned 12. She had grown a little taller. Her hair had grown longer, and she often wore an old brown hoodie, a gift that Walter had bought at a village fair. The life between the two of them was as simple as the cycles of the seasons. Then one day, an express letter arrived. Walter opened the letter in the living room. A few short lines, printed on cold white paper. "We are deeply sorry to inform you that your daughter Linda passed away in a traffic accident on the night of October 2nd. His hands trembled. His old eyes no longer cried easily, but his heart felt as if someone was squeezing it. He folded the letter, sat down on a wooden chair, and looked out the window, where Emma was painting beside the apple tree. Walter did not tell the story right away. It wasn't until the evening, after dinner, When the two of them sat drinking apple tea as usual, that he spoke softly. "Your mother is gone." Emma was speechless. Her hand dropped the cup she was holding. The tea spilled on her shirt, but she didn't notice. When? Her voice trembled. "Last week. Car accident." She nodded. There were no tears, no cries, just an empty gaze, as if the whole world had gone silent. That night, Walter heard sobbing coming from Emma's room. He didn't go in, just sat leaning against the hallway, like a gatekeeper to her sadness. 3 weeks later, a black car stopped right in front of the house. A man stepped out of the car, a black suit, a crimson tie, walking straight, but his eyes were furtive like a wild animal stalking its prey. It was him, the man from years ago. Linda's husband, Emma's stepfather. "Mr. Walter," he said, half polite, half cold, "I've come to get Emma. Her mother is dead, and I'm her legal guardian." Walter stood silently on the steps, his eyes dark. He didn't come down, nor did he invite him in. "She's not going anywhere. With all due respect." He pulled a sheaf of papers from his pocket. "I have full custody of her. It's a court order, and her mother agreed to sign it. She's my responsibility." Emma stepped out of the house, just in time to see him. Her whole body froze. The pencil she was holding fell to the porch floor, breaking in two. In her eyes, it was no longer the image of her guardian, but a real nightmare. Standing there in broad daylight, she backed away, slipping on the floor, her mouth trembling as she uttered two words. "No, no." Walter turned around, catching his niece in time. He put his arms around her, his eyes as hard as cold iron. "Get off my land," he said in a low, steady voice. "If you come back without the courthouse behind you, I'll call the police." The man said nothing more. He gave Emma one last look, curled his lips, half a smile, half a threat, and turned and walked back to his car. The black car disappeared behind the corn. Emma was still shaking in his arms. Walter knew. This war had only just begun. The next morning, Walter went to the county courthouse to ask about the guardianship. The clerk, after checking the records, confirmed that Linda's husband, Emma's stepfather, was now the legal guardian. According to the papers signed earlier, "Unless you have proof that this person is unfit," she said, "you cannot keep your granddaughter without his consent or a court order." Walter left the courthouse feeling bitter. He had believed in the law all his life, but now it was like a trap set, forcing a child back to a place that had scared her to sleep. When he told Emma that he needed a lawyer, she panicked. "I don't want to go to court. I don't want to see him anymore." Walter hugged her. "I know, but without a court, we can't protect you forever." Emma was silent. She understood, but the fear in her eyes could not be hidden, like a small fire still smoldering in her heart. News of the custody dispute spread throughout the village. Some people supported Walter, but many others were scornful. "That man is the husband of the girl's mother. After all, Mr. Walter has no legal rights. She is just an illegitimate child, not your biological child." Walter did not respond. He had no time for gossip. He spent every evening taking notes, writing in his diary, collecting every memory, every detail that Emma had ever shared, even if it was just a drawing, a dream, a vague statement. One day, when Walter went to get the mail, he heard screaming in the house. He rushed in, to find Emma huddled beside the desk, her head in her hands. On the floor was a new letter, an unmarked black envelope, with a photograph inside. Emma with her mother and him. From the angle of the photograph, you could see his hand on Emma's shoulder, squeezing it tightly, unnaturally. Emma sobbed. He knew, he wanted me to remember." Walter squeezed the photograph tightly in his hand, then threw it into the fireplace. The scorched pieces swirled with black smoke. No one is allowed to scare me again." 2 days later, Walter met with a young lawyer named Laura, who had been his daughter's student. After listening to him, she was silent for a moment, then said, "We can file for a temporary restraining order, if we can prove that Emma is in danger of mental or physical harm. But we'll need proof, and Emma might have to go to court." Walter nodded. "As long as my niece isn't taken away." Laura looked at him, her eyes determined, but also tired with age, and she said, "Then we'll start today." That evening, Emma put the sketchbook on the table. The first page was a picture of a wooden house. Two figures standing side by side, one tall, with a silver beard, the other small. Drawing. On the roof were the words in small letters in crayon. Home, where no strange footsteps are heard. Walter put his hand on Emma's head. Gently. This fight would not be easy. But he would not lose. The day of the trial came sooner than Walter expected. Every morning, he took Emma for a walk around the fields to calm her down. She was still quiet, but for the first time, she held his hand tightly, as if trying to hold on to the last bit of peace. "You don't have to say anything if you're not ready," Walter said as they sat under the apple tree. "The court can hear from anyone else. But if you're willing to talk, I'll be there for you." Emma nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the distant horizon. The county courthouse was in the center of the small town, where all eyes were on the heated dispute. Inside the courtroom, cold white light fell on the wooden table and benches behind it. Emma's stepfather sat with his lawyer, a silver-haired man. Smooth and convincing, he wore a gray suit, and his demeanor was calm, as if everything was in his hands. Walter's lawyer Laura, on the other hand, was young, inexperienced, but her eyes were always burning with enthusiasm. She stood beside Walter and Emma, holding a thin file, which contained what the two had been preparing for the past months: Walter's diary, Emma's drawings, and a few vague statements. Not enough, Laura thought. We need something really strong. The trial began. The plaintiffs, the stepfather's side, produced the marriage certificate, the legal guardianship agreement that Emma's mother had signed before she died. His lawyer argued clearly, "My client is the sole legal guardian at the moment. Mr. Walter, as the maternal grandfather, has no clear legal right to keep the child." When questioned, he said softly, "I love her like my own daughter. The current estrangement is due to Mr. Walter's deliberate attempt to separate her." Walter almost jumped up in protest, but Laura put a hand on his shoulder, reassuring him gently. It was the defense's turn. Laura presented her suspicions: Emma's erratic behavior, her nightmares, her unstable drawings, and her extreme fear of her stepfather. The judge nodded, but his face gave little away. "Does she have anything to say herself?" he asked, his voice soft but clear. Emma sat with her head bowed. After a long moment, she shook her head slightly. Her lips pressed together, her hands clasped together until they were white. "No, I don't want to talk." The silence stretched. Laura stood up, trying to keep her composure. "Your Honor, children who have been traumatized often don't tell the truth right away. But that doesn't mean the trauma isn't there." The plaintiff's lawyer chuckled, then retorted, "And we can't rely on feelings as a substitute for evidence." The judge asked both sides to sit down, and he would consider the decision later. Walter felt his hands shaking for the first time in years. He felt helpless. Emma turned to him, whispering, "If I tell you, will I be able to stay with you forever?" Walter looked deeply into his granddaughter's eyes, eyes that had been betrayed too many times. "No one can take you away from me if I'm brave enough to stay." The girl looked at him, nodding slowly. Her eyes were no longer dull, but lit up with a small spark. The judge put down the file, took off his glasses, and exhaled softly. The courtroom fell into a tense silence. He looked around, his voice low and steady. "There is no direct evidence or clear testimony from the victim. The details provided, while thought-provoking, are not sufficient to deny the plaintiff legal guardianship." Walter felt his heart sink to a stone. Emma sat beside him, eyes wide, but unblinking, as if time had frozen. "Therefore," the judge continued, "the court will wait." A female voice rang out from the back of the courtroom, cutting off the statement. Everyone turned. A woman entered. She was petite, her hair tied back in a hurry, her eyes a mixture of worry and determination. She stood in the middle of the courtroom, looking straight at the judge. My name is Maria. I used to work for his family. And I have something to say." Laura's lawyer hurried over to her, whispering confirmation of her identity. Maria shakily extended her hand. It held a copy of Emma's stepfather's old personnel file. "I'll be a witness," she said. "I saw him act inappropriately toward her." The courtroom shook. The plaintiff's lawyer objected immediately. But the judge raised his hand to maintain order. Maria continued, her voice shaking at first but growing firmer. "I saw him put his hands on Emma while she was napping. Not once. I tried to tell her mother. But he threatened to sue me, fire me, and, worse, I was touched by him too." She paused, took a deep breath. "But today, I can't stay silent. I don't want another child to be afraid of their stepfather." Emma bowed her head, tears starting to fall. Walter put his arm around her shoulders, like a cliff protecting her from a fierce storm. Laura's lawyer immediately asked the court to allow Maria to be an additional witness. The judge nodded. The brief interrogation took place. Maria answered clearly, her eyes never leaving the man she once called boss. The stepfather sat motionless. His eyes were no longer arrogant, but slightly trembling. He understood, this time. The mask had fallen. After a few minutes of deliberation, the judge returned, his voice more serious than ever. Based on the direct testimony of the new witness and the current psychological state of little Emma, the court declares the temporary suspension of the plaintiff's guardianship. The custody and care will belong to the maternal grandfather, Walter Graves, until the final investigation is concluded. Walter breathed a sigh of relief, his hand tightly clasping Emma's trembling little hand. The little girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears, but no longer tears of fear, but tears of joy, as if the whole world had just turned on. As she walked out of the courtroom, the early afternoon sunlight was slanting through the large glass windows. Emma gently squeezed his hand, looking up. "You won't have nightmares anymore, right?" Walter chuckled, gently placing his hand on her head. "If you do, I'll dream with you, so you two can know how to get out." Behind, Maria stood silently watching, her hands clutching the cloth bag. She said nothing, only smiled slightly. Perhaps, for the first time in many years, she had just escaped her own darkness. The following spring, Emma stood on the threshold of 13. She was no longer the shy girl who had hidden behind her grandfather, but a growing woman, with a deeper, more determined gaze, as if the dark nights she had experienced had forged a strong heart. Walter's old wooden house gradually came to life. The flower pots on the porch were in full bloom, and paintings covered the walls. Emma turned the attic into her own studio, where she spent hours each week drawing, not just to forget, but to tell. One of the most striking paintings was of two silhouettes sitting side by side under an apple tree, one tall, one small. In the corner of the painting, she wrote, "We sat through many summers, and each was the first." Walter was getting older. His hair was gray, and his hands sometimes trembled as he made his morning tea. But the smile remained the same, and it was still a special smile reserved for his granddaughter. Every evening, he sat on the porch, listening to Emma tell stories about school, her friends, the times she slipped and fell on the soccer field, or the time her art teacher asked her, "Who did you learn to draw from?" "From someone who couldn't hold a brush," she replied, "but knew how to balance my heart." Walter smiled. "That's flattering." "Not flattering," Emma said slyly. "I'm thanking you." The years that followed flowed like a smooth river, smooth, steady, without thunder or sudden shadows. Emma grew taller, almost as tall as him, with her hair cut short to her shoulders, often tied back with a blue ribbon, the color she called the most peaceful. One summer day, when Emma was 16, she was invited to participate in a state youth art exhibition. Among the selected works, there was one that made people pause the longest, a small wooden roof, with two old wooden chairs in front, one of them empty. Beneath it was the inscription, "There are people who don't go to school to be parents, but they live like a mountain." Walter stood beside his granddaughter at the exhibition. He said nothing, just smiled, his eyes sparkling like the sunlight on the rice fields. One day, after they sat watching the sunset, Emma suddenly asked, "If you hadn't kept me, did you ever think about what would have happened?" Walter was silent for a long time. "I thought you would have lived. But maybe, you would have lived like a tree that has been broken and has to grow back, crooked. Weak. Now you grow straight, even with scars. That's what I know." Emma nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. The summer wind blew through the porch, carrying the scent of lavender and unspoken words. The day Emma graduated from high school. The sun was mild. The schoolyard was festooned with flags and flowers. Rows of chairs were neatly arranged. And in the crowd of parents, Walter sat on a folding wooden chair, wearing an old straw hat, the only thing he found suitable for such a solemn occasion. He watched Emma walk up to the stage to receive her diploma. Her hair was tied back. Her smile was bright. Her steps were confident as if she had never been afraid of the dark. Unlike the other children, Emma did not walk alone. She held out her hand, inviting Walter to walk up with her. The whole schoolyard was silent for a few seconds. Then there was a round of applause, soft but sincere. When she received her diploma, she turned to him and said softly enough for only he to hear, "I'm standing here because you never left your seat." Walter laughed, his throat tightening. He didn't need any more words. That one look was enough to last a lifetime. That evening, after a small party with a few close friends, Emma and he returned to the familiar wooden house. The sky was full of stars. Walter sat on a wooden bench on the porch, and Emma, in a simple white dress, carried 2 glasses of apple juice. Placing one in his hand, "You know," she began, "many people ask me if I resent the past. What do you say?" "I say no. I'm just grateful for what I have now. And I'm proud that I got through it without losing myself." Walter nodded, not answering. He took a sip of apple juice, then leaned his head back against the back of the chair. They were both silent for a moment, listening only to the chirping of insects in the night. Emma pulled a folded letter from her skirt pocket. She handed it to him, saying, "I wrote this in my last English class. The topic was, write to someone who changed your life. But I didn't turn it in. I wanted to give it to you." Walter opened it, the familiar slanted handwriting, each line imbued with something both mature and innocent. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be me. If it weren't for you, I would have thought adults were the ones who kept quiet when children needed saving. If it weren't for you, I would have grown up believing that love was conditional. But thanks to you, I learned that there are people who are willing to go against the flow. That family isn't just blood, but a place where people choose to hold on to each other. That true love is when someone dares to sit quietly in the hallway all night, just so someone doesn't feel lonely." Walter read the last line. His eyes blurred. Emma leaned her head on his shoulder and asked softly, "Are you tired?" "No," he replied hoarsely. "I have never felt more alive than I do now." The moon was high, casting a soft light on the wooden roof. A gentle breeze blew through the apple orchard, rustling the old leaves. On the wooden bench, 2 people, one old, one young, sat silently, as if they were the quietest part of an ever-changing world. And as that night ended, so did Emma's childhood, complete, whole, without a single piece missing. Emma's story may be over, but what she went through, and how she recovered from it, resonates. What do you think of this journey? About a girl who lost her childhood, but found it again through the silent love of a grumpy old man? About a maid who dared to speak the truth when no one else dared? About courtrooms, where the law seems cold, but there is still room for courage, for justice? Have you ever known an Emma, or been one? Do you believe that love, however clumsy, however late, can be a savior? And if not, perhaps now is the time to start believing. See you in the next story. Daily Unexpected Stories Team.